Hello again and welcome to another Warlord Wednesdays. This is the episode of the week where we talk about all things bolt action. And today, guys, I've got a really good video for you. I'm going to be continuing with the series of videos that I've been doing recently, which is bolt action videos aimed at 40k players. So what we're going to be talking about today is which faction should you pick if you're a 40k player coming over and you want to check out bolt action for the first time. Now, of course, the first thing that it's worth pointing out is that bolt action and 40k are not the same game. Of course they're not mordianglorytv. What are you talking about? Oh, you're an idiot. No, what I mean is that it's not, there's no direct parallels, there's no direct comparisons. It's not like if you were going and playing, another, like you're going like from StarCraft to Warhammer 40k and you'd be like, well, I can collect Tyranids, and that's the same as like, if I was playing Zerg on the computer game or whatever. It's not, there's no direct comparison like that. Every army in bolt action can kind of be tailored to suit any kind of playstyle that you want. But there are naturally, depending on the faction traits, there are naturally some armies which tend to try and lean towards a certain playstyle, or warlords have tried to sort of say, this is kind of how the army should be played, but hey, you do you and you do whatever you want. So that's one thing to mention. You can collect any faction you want. You can make it work in any way that you want. If you want a close combat German army, you go for it. If you want a shooting Japanese army, you go for it. However you want to run it, you can run it. But there are some natural factions, some natural comparisons that we can draw. And if you're of a certain playstyle, then I would say, this is the faction you probably want to consider. So I thought I'd get that little addendum out of the way, that little sort of caveat. Without further ado, let's dive into today's video. So the bolt action factions that we're going to be drawing some parallels to today is going to be the United States, Great Britain, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union. Now, there are more factions than this, and some of them you could argue are just as important, but these are the major factions and the main factions that most people play when they're getting into bolt action. Of course, you do have armies like Finland and Italy that, are fairly popular, but they're still considered minor factions. So we're not going to be really covering those. They might give them an honourable mention, but we're going to be focusing on the 5 main factions of bolt action. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is the United States. Now, I would say that if you are a 140k player that's coming over to bolt action for the first time, then I would see the United States very much as the Space Marines of bolt action. Now, some people may agree with this and some people may not, but here are my reasonings for why I think that the United States are very much a good sort of starter army for anyone that's getting into bolt action. I guess that's kind of the first point that I've made already. They're a fantastic starter army. They've got a really good wide selection of units. They can be used in most of the more common time periods. You can be used from sort of early war, sort of late early war, mid-war, and late war, which is what a lot of people like to play. Most people, when they're playing casual action, will play sort of mid-war and late war. Early war is a bit specialist, so you're not missing out on too much there at all. So they're a really good sort of starter intro faction. They're well supported by warlords, and they're an incredibly flexible force. If you take your standard armies of United States sort of force, what you're going to be looking at is you're going to have decent infantry. You're never going to have the best infantry in the game, but you're never going to have the worst infantry in the game. You've got fantastic firepower, but again, you're never going to have the best firepower in the game, but you're never going to have the worst firepower in the game. Your infantry will be able to go toe-to-toe with pretty much anyone else's infantry out there, but occasionally they're going to come across something which might outsmart them, might outdo them. You're very maneuverable. Most marine armies like to be on the move, but they're not, super fast, but they are very maneuverable. With your ability to move and shoot without penalty, you tend to find that, Marines tend to find that Americans like to move, get into nice close range, medium range firefights. That's where they dominate the best. When it comes to your artillery and armour capabilities, you neither have, again, it's going to sound very familiar, you don't have the best artillery, you don't have the worst artillery, you don't have the best armour, you don't have the worst armour. Where you shine with your armour forces as Americans is in the medium armour category. There is a Sherman for every job. And it's like when you look at Marines. Marines never have Space Marines never have the heaviest armour in 40k. Like there's always even the standard Imperial Guard tank is always heavier than the standard Space Marine tank. That's kind of just how it is. But Marine tanks always pack a decent amount of firepower. They're always okay for their points. And so that's kind of very much how the Sherman is. It's perfectly okay for its points. You don't need to take one, but if you take one, you're not going to be let down by it. So that's why I personally think that the United States are really similar to your basic sort of Space Marine army. Now, another point I'd make on this is that the United States has access to a couple of what I would call sub-factions that would really relate to some of the specific chapters of Space Marines that you find in 40k. So you've got your three essential sort of three factions. You've got your main armies of the United States. As we've just covered, these are your basic Marines. This will cover just if you had a standard Marine Codex, maybe running Ultramarines or something like that. Ultramarines, Imperial Fist, Dark Angels, that kind of thing. That's where you're looking at your sort of your standard armies of the United States. If you're looking for a more shooting orientated Space Marine chapter, one that's maybe a little bit tougher, a little bit more shooty, but has the ability to get up close and personal when needed, then you've got the US Airborne. US Airborne are fantastic, and I definitely say they tend to lean towards being a more shooting sort of force. They are great because they are veterans, so they can Barney in combat if you want to, but you tend to find that they've got access to an okay amount of submachine guns, but they're not as equipped for submachine guns as the United States Marine Corps and all that kind of stuff. So I tend to find your Airborne are your more durable, your more elite, your more shooty side of your force of the United States, and that is as an airborne player. That's why I tend to find that I use them. And then you have the other end of the spectrum for your more combat orientated Space Marine chapters, where you've got the United States Marine Corps. Now, the United States Marine Corps, some of you might say, what are you talking about, Morning Glory? They get access to so much firepower. Yeah, they do. They get access to just as much firepower as any other American style force out there. Not denying that whatsoever. But what they do get the ability to do is really load up on combat weapons. And they really get the access to shotguns. They get access to all sorts of submachine guns and pistols, and you can just make them tough fighter, and you can make them stubborn, you can make them veteran, and so you can just make them really hard, good at shooting, and fantastic at combat at the same time. So that's why I was saying, if you want to build like a really strong close combat United States Marine Army, you want to be looking down the Marine Corps. For the United States, I'm going to be looking down the Marine Corps. So that's why I tend to find that your armies of the United States are quite good at being drawn as a parallel to the Warhammer 40k Space Marines. You've got a really flexible force, you can tailor it to however you want, but you've got these couple of sub-factions which allow you to almost emulate some of the more combat-related chapters that Space Marines have. So that's the first faction that we're going to cover. Now we're going to move on to the next faction. Now, the next faction that we're going to look at, we're going to continue with the Western Allies, and we're going to take a look at the armies of Great Britain. Now, this was a really tricky one. When I was thinking about this one, I thought, what do the Brits do that's similar to 40k factions? Because they really can do a bit of anything. They can be tailored to do almost any kind of play style, but they're not necessarily fantastic at any kind of play style. They can do close combat stuff with tough as old boots and up and atom and stuff like that, which allows you to get more close combat buffs, or they can do more shooting buffs with rapid fire. You see, the Brits, unlike other factions in Bot Action which have set regiment traits, they actually get a list that they get to pick from. They get to pick one when they're building their army list. So then I thought, well, they've got decent infantry, but not the best infantry, and they can build almost a horde of rubbish infantry, because they can take inexperienced home guard units, or they can take some really hardcore elite infantry like Gurkhas. There's just so much variety in the roster, and then they have such a fantastic amount of armor. And then I thought, well, you know what that's like? That's like the Imperial Guard. Imperial Guard armies have a huge variety of units to draw upon. But we're never necessarily the best at anything, but we do like our tanks. And the Brits certainly have access to as many tanks as the Germans do, and they have access to heavy armour as well. There's all sorts of fairly affordable heavy armour that the Brits get access to, which is kind of rare. When you think about the German heavy armour, you think about Tigers, and you think about Panthers, and you think about Tiger 2s, but all of those are relatively expensive units. When you come over to the Brit roster and you look at their heavy tanks like the Churchill, they're not as expensive points-wise at all. So, you know, your typical sort of German heavy tank is going to start setting you back 350 plus points. Whereas you can find British heavy tanks that will set you back for much cheaper than that. 275, I believe it is, for a Churchill AVRE, which is very much like the Demolisher tank. So my thoughts are that if you love tanks and you want to have all the tank choice in the world, you want to be thinking about Brits, and you also want to be quote unquote the good guys. So that's where I would say you want to be looking if you're an Imperial Guard player. You know, the armies of Great Britain, you'll have access to some great vehicles. You'll never have the best tanks, but you'll always have some great tanks. And likewise, your infantry is pretty flexible as well. What you tend to find with standard British infantry is it kind of, you know, they don't have the best machine guns, but they have access to machine guns. They don't have the best SMGs, like the Soviets can spam SMGs for days, but you do get access to SMGs. You can't move and fire as much as the Americans can, but you can get some extra rifle shots with rapid fire. That very much emulates first rank fire, second rank fire. So my analogy would be is that the Brits are very much like the Imperial Guard. You know, they're a bit like the Empire in Warhammer Fantasy. You've got a huge unit selection. You've got war machines, you've got tanks, you've got infantry, you've got combat units. You've got absolutely everything. But you're never going to be as combat-y as the Japanese. You're never going to have as good tanks as the Germans. You're never going to have the maneuverability of the Americans. But you're going to be able to do a bit of everything, and you'll be absolutely fine. And you also get a bit of focus on artillery with your free artillery observer. So really, for me, the focus on, you know, solid infantry with a huge armour selection and fantastic artillery. The Brits get fantastic artillery as well. For me, that naturally lends towards the Imperial Guard. So we've sort of covered the Western Allies now. So we're going to now start moving on to sort of the Axis and the Soviet Union. Now, the first Axis faction that we're going to cover is Germany. Now, Germany's a really interesting one because you could draw parallels to them being like the Space Marines, and the reason for that is you tend to find that everyone and their mum has a German army, because a lot of people, when they get into action, will collect two factions. They'll collect one of the Allies factions, either the Soviets or Americans or Brits, and then when it comes to them collecting an Axis faction, they naturally tend to go towards the Germans, because the Germans fought on every front. Unlike the Japanese, who you tend to be stuck in the Pacific, and then it's kind of a bit strange if you've got US airborne fighting Japanese. That didn't really happen historically. So most people tend to gravitate towards having Germans as their second army. And so I originally, when I was doing this video, thought maybe the Germans are kind of like the Space Marines. But I ended up deciding that the Germans were more like, bit of a crazy one here, the Germans were more like Chaos and Tau. Okay, now some of you are going to say, those are very different factions, Mordian Glory. Why do you think the Germans are like Chaos and Tau? Well, firstly, naturally, they're kind of like Chaos because they are sort of the bad guys of the setting. You know, that is, you can't get away from that unescapable sort of fact, or sort of parallel. So, firstly, you know, they're naturally the bad guys. And so very much like in 40k, where the two main protagonists and antagonists are the Imperium and Chaos. I mean, some people, you know, Eldar and other Xenos are big, but the main bad guys have always been, you know, it's the Imperium versus Chaos. That's the main setting, with orcs running around in the background having a great time. But likewise, in bot action, the main factions you tend to see played against each other a lot are the Western Allies versus the Germans. Now, obviously, Soviet Union is still really popular and Japanese are still really popular, but that's kind of like the main setting, is the Western Allies versus the Germans. So that's kind of why I sort of put them as Chaos. And very much like Chaos, you can tailor your German army to represent a very standard army like Chaos Undivided, or you can go and try and tailor them to be a bit more like a specific god. So if you want a really durable, like Death Guard style army, then you can take veterans, and for days. Germans have got all sorts of veteran stuff. If you want to be sort of immune to morale, then the Germans certainly, and you go maybe more down like a fanatical Slaneshi kind of route, then you've got the Waffen SS, who are a fantastic source of fanatics for the Germans. You've then also, if you want to go down, you know, with the Death Guard units as well, you've got all of the German tanks, which are really, really durable. The Germans have, you know, thanks to their ability, they're like fanatics and stuff, you can go down the Korn route. And then with Zinch, I guess Zinch is a little bit more difficult, but the Germans do have access to some really wacky and wonderful weapons as well. So I tend to say that they do fall into that sort of chaos sort of category. Speaking of the tanks and the wonder weapons, this is another thing that I find makes sort of natural parallels between Germans and chaos in 40k. Is chaos is really where at the moment GW has really gone down sort of the demon engine route. You have these really crazy sort of units. But also, some of them tend to be really, really durable, really, really effective as well. And whilst you look at regular Space Marines, where have they been fleshed out by GW? They've been fleshed out with all the kinds of infantry under the sun. Which, you've got every Primaris, every kind of Primaris flavour of ice cream that you want. Likewise, that kind of draws parallels to the fact the Americans have got loads of, are very much an infantry-focused army. And Chaos has loads and loads of demon engines, and the Germans are very much a wonder weapon, very much a tank-focused army. And if you want some of the best, hands down, the best tanks in the game, the best equipment in the game, and the best firepower in the game, then you want to be looking at the Germans. And this is very much, they do get some of the best firepower. And this is kind of why I say they're like the Tau as well. The German tendency to just want to slap machine guns on absolutely everything and just gun line and do loads and loads and loads of shooting is and their heavy armor, having some of the best equipment, really sort of helps them draw parallels towards the Tau as well. When I play my Germans, what I'll tend to do is I will gun line for a turn or two, really win the firefight, and then move out. Very much like a sort of classic 3rd or 4th edition Tau style list. So this is why I tend to say that they're not the bad guys that's kind of chaotic. They get some really cool, crazy gear and equipment and tanks, which is a bit like demon engines, but they also have fantastic firepower. I'd say that the Germans probably have some of the best firepower in bot action when you're just looking at your sort of standard German list. And one of the things I would say with Germans is, if you're not running the best tank on the battlefield, you're kind of not running them properly, right? And that kind of leads them similar to like Tau. Tau, if you're not running the best firepower on the field, you're kind of running them wrong. So that covers the Germans. So now let's move on to the other main Axis faction, the Japanese. Now, the Japanese are a relatively easy one to do. If you like orcs, you're going to like the Japanese. If you like Khorne Berserkers, you're going to like the Japanese. Hell, if you like Gene Stealer Cult, you're going to like the Japanese. Basically, if you like any combat army, be it Xenos or Imperium, if you just love running combat armies, then Japanese are the army for you. They are the best close combat army, hands down, without a shadow of a doubt. You can make them a good shooting army, and I know that's a way that a lot of people like to run them, but if you're just getting into it for the first time, you want to run your standard Japanese army, you are going to be winning the combat fight. Japanese are one of and the reason why I like sort of drawing parallels like Gene Stealer Cult as well is, the first time you face a Japanese army, it's going to smash you. If the opponent knows what they're doing, it's going to absolutely smash you, because you're not going to be ready for just quite how bonkers they are. But once you've got the measure of them, you'll start beating them quite regularly. And that's kind of similar with Gene Stealer Cult, like traditionally. First time you face Gene Stealer Cult, they've got so many tricks coming out their arsehole that they're going to catch you unawares, and you're going to lose the game. But once you face them a few times, you tend to find that actually they are beatable. You just have to know all the tips and tricks. Japanese are really like that. Likewise, if you want to run your classic green tide orcs, look no further than the Japanese. Now, the reason why they're like this is very simple. They have army-wide fanatics. And for those that don't know what fanatics does, it basically means you ignore all morale all the time, basically, for your Japanese, and that's just army-wide. Fanatics is normally a rule that people have to pay top premium for, top points for in bot action, and the Japanese get it for free army-wide, which is so they're not taking morale, and when you get into combat, rather than whoever wins the first round of combat wins the combat overall, Japanese will literally fight in combat to the last man. So it's really big. That Fanatic rule is massive. They can charge up the field, and then they can just sit in combat, and they'll tend to beat anything in combat that they get in touch with. The other thing that they get, which makes them really, really good, is they get the Banzai rule, which means no matter how many pin markers you've got on you, you could have 10 pin markers on you, it doesn't matter, you don't care, you can always charge forward. So that's why they're your classic black tide, they're your classic green tide, any kind of combat tide you can think of, berserker tide, any tide you can think of, Japanese do it. There's not much more I need to say about them. They have not got very good armor. They've got some of, weirdly, they've got some of the most cost-effective infantry, but their armor is actually really points efficient because it's just so cheap because you're not paying for any upgrades on them or anything. But they are a combat infantry style army, and that is, if that's the kind of army you like to collect, that's where you need to be going for Japanese. They're fast, they're fierce, they're fantastic, and they're fanatical. And they are probably one of my favourite armies for running about action because they're just so bonkers that I love it. So it's just like that, they scratch that green tide itch I've always wanted from 40k, but I get it in my bot action games with my Japanese. So that is all of the Axis. Now let's take a look at the Soviet Union. So last but certainly not least, we have the Soviet Union. Now the Soviet Union is a massive faction with a huge variety of units available to it, but it is also one of the older ones in bot action. But I would say that very much like we've said throughout this video, they kind of do anything. But if I was to draw some parallels, and if I was to make sure that I wasn't just repeating the same things over and over again, I would say the Soviet Union is similar to 3 kinds of faction. Okay, they are similar to the Imperial Guard. Of course they are. Masses of conscripts backed up by some of the heaviest tanks out there. Of course you could naturally say they're like the Imperial Guard. But I would also say that they're not as like the Imperial Guard as you might think. Like you might find, and the simple reason for that is they tend to find their units are quite set. They're quite specialist. So you can get like guards units which are, can take a little bit of everything. But you tend to find that Soviets have rifle squads, and the infantry there can only take rifles, or they've got SMG squads, and the infantry there can only take SMGs, or you've got light machine gun squads, and they can only take light machine guns. And you don't, unlike the Brits, which you can take SMGs and light machine guns and all sorts of stuff in the units, the Soviet units tend to be a lot more narrow. They tend to be, you've got rifles in the squad, and that's it. No choices for you. So I would actually say, whilst they can do that sort of quintessential guard, conscript, and tank sort of army, I would say they're very much like Tyranids as well, because Tyranids, obviously, your Hormagaunts, they get claws. Their infantry is more specialist. Your Termagants get, you can give them devourers, but you tend to just give them, they all get flesh borers, right? So, but they are like a horde style army with big bugs that back them up. So that's why I would say that the Soviets are actually a really good parallel for if you're a Tyranid player that wants to consider getting into bot action, or you're an Imperial Guard, conscript and tank player that wants to get into bot action. I would say the Soviet Union is a really, really good army for you there. I know it's going to sound a bit crazy. I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here. I'm going to stick my neck out. I'd also say, whilst it might not seem like it at first, I'd also say that they can feel, depending on how you build them, they can feel a little bit like an Eldar army as well. Now, some people are going to say that's absolutely mad, right? But bot action, of course, allows you to take, the Soviets like a classic enemy at the gate style Soviet army. The Soviets also have some of the most durable and some of the just most specialist infantry out there, very much like the Eldar. So, and this is where I was sort of talking about where you've got your SMG squads. It's a bit like with Eldar, where you get, everyone in the Striking Scorpion unit gets the same weapon loadouts. Everyone in the Dire Avenger unit gets the same weapon loadouts. You can't really tailor them very much. You've got what you've got. And so you can run hordes of just riflemen. But some of the more effective Soviet armies that I've ever seen have taken advantage of great maneuverability and have taken advantage of the fact that they have some really good specialist infantry that will beat their counterparts one-to-one in almost sort of any situation. And Soviets are a really, really strong faction. One of the strongest ones out there. I faced off against the Soviet army fairly regularly, and in the hands of a very good player. He was a fantastic 40k player. Now he's one of the best Age of Sigmar players that I know. And he uses Soviets, and he is. I struggle to beat him now. and he's been playing Bolt Action for a quarter of the time that I've been playing it. So I really think that, and he is an Eldar player at heart, and he's built his Soviets to be a bit like that as well. So that's kind of why I thought about the Elder panel, because the Elder player that I know plays Soviets in Bolt Action, so I thought I'd just mention that. But I want to end the video the way I started the video by saying that any faction Bolt Action can be twisted and tailored into any kind of 40k faction that you feel like. So you might be a Custodians player. I've focused on kind of the main factions in 40k and compared them to the main factions in Bolt Action. But if you're a Custodians player, then don't feel like, oh, there's no faction here for me. You could go down German route. You could go down the Waffen SS, and you could make all of your veterans fanatic, and you'll be paying the most per infantry model in Bolt Action. That's 16 points per infantry. It's just really huge. And you could be like, I am never going to fail a morale check. I'm going to beat the shit out of everyone in close combat. I've got all of the best gear, and I'm paying the most per model. But I am going to be outnumbered pretty much every single game that I play. There you go, you've got your Custodians there. Or you might say, I want to play, you could go down the British Commando route, where all of you, if you go British Commandos and then you use some of the supplement stuff from Soft Underbelly, you're paying similar level of points, and you're like, yeah, I could get a Custodians feel for these guys as well, because I've got some absolutely dead, hard, combat, stubborn infantry. And so you've got Custodians, which literally fit in to Waffen SS and then into British Commandos. Two totally separate factions that play that, completely differently, but they'll feel very at home for your Custodians player there. And maybe like your Dark Angels player that loves Deathwing. Those two factions I just mentioned, the fanatic Waffen SS and the stubborn British Commandos, you're going to feel like, yes, I'm playing my Terminators in Bolt Action. You're going to feel it. So my point is that you can tailor any faction how you want. You might want to play a really sort of janky Genestealer culty style army. Well, you could do that with Brits as well. You could do, Brits have got all sorts of crazy colonial units that you can draw upon that allow you to infiltrate your whole army forward and stuff like that. But likewise, we haven't even touched upon the minor factions. If you collect like a minor faction in 40k, you might find that you're going to want to look at some of the minor factions in Bolt Action. For example, you might say, you know what, I don't want to collect Japanese. I want to collect something on the Western Front, but I'm a Genestealer cult player. What do I go for? I'd say to you then, start looking at the Finns. The Finns have got some absolutely fantastic, just sort of crazy ambush style rules, which is, Genestealer cult love to ambush people, Finns love to ambush people. So, you might want to just play a game where you lose all the time. Well, at that point, you want to pick the Italians. I'm only joking. Sorry to my Italian players out there, I'm sorry. But the point is that there's loads of flexibility. And that if you're a 40k player, I guarantee you will find a faction in Bolt Action that you feel at home with. Just go and check them out. Just go and check them out. And, if you've got a particular play style, go and find that play style. You will find it in Bolt Action, I guarantee it. So we're going to wrap the video up there. I hope you guys have enjoyed today's video. If you have, please consider giving it a like and a subscribe. And if you've really enjoyed today's video and you want to support the channel even more, please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. It really does make a huge difference. We're getting close to the point with the Mordian Glory channel where I might even be able to go full time soon. And that is thanks to the generous support of the Patreons and the generous support of my channel members. So I want to say a massive thank you to everyone that is a channel member and is a Patreon supporter. You guys, you know how valuable you are. I can't make a big enough deal out of it. So just a huge thank you to all of you. But we'll leave the video there. I hope you enjoyed it. And of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.